I require a duchess. You require an escape. It is a plain and practical transaction. The Duke of Kestrel Chase spoke the words as if discussing the purchase of a new horse. His voice was low and devoid of inflection. A flat, grey stone dropped into the silent pond of Louisa Ingram's life. They stood in the dim, book-lined study of her stepmother's house, a room Louisa was permitted to enter only to dust. Outside, a miserable autumn rain wept against the window panes. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old paper and the Duke's unnerving stillness. Gideon Devereux was not a handsome man in the poetic sense. His face was all harsh angles and shadows, his eyes a pale, wintry gray that seemed to assess everything for its worth and find it wanting. He was wealthy beyond measure, powerful beyond imagining, and, it was whispered, as cold as the marble crypt where his first wife lay. Louisa's hands, clasped before her, were perfectly steady. She had learned long ago that to show emotion was to provide a weapon to her enemies. And in this house, everyone was an enemy. "A transaction, Your Grace?" she asked, her own voice a quiet counterpoint to his. "I will be precise," he said, appreciating her lack of hysterics. "My estate is in chaos. The staff are ungoverned, the accounts are a disaster, and the county vultures are circling. I have no time for the niceties of courtship, nor the inclination. I need a manager, a woman of intelligence, discretion, and fortitude. The title of Duchess provides the necessary authority." Just that morning, he had arrived to settle a tedious land dispute with her stepmother, Lady Honora Fenwick. Honora and her solicitor had unrolled a large, impressive map across the dining table, all fawning smiles and careful misrepresentations. They had pointed to a boundary line, citing a stream that had, for generations, marked the edge of the Devereux lands. It was Louisa, standing silently by the sideboard with the tea tray, who had spoken. "Forgive me, Your Grace," she had said, her voice barely a whisper, "but that stream was diverted after the great flood of '21. The boundary now follows the old stone wall at the edge of Fenwick Copse." The room had frozen. Lady Fenwick's face had tightened into a mask of fury. The solicitor had sputtered, but the Duke had simply looked at her. It was not a look of gratitude or surprise. It was a look of pure, unadulterated assessment. He had walked to the window, looked out across the damp fields to where the line of the old wall was just visible, and then returned to the table. "She is correct," he stated, and the matter was closed. He had seen her, not as a person, but as a source of accurate data. Now, it seemed, he wished to acquire that source. "And you believe I and that woman?" Louisa asked now in the quiet of the study. "I observed you for 2 hours this morning," he stated. "You managed your stepmother's tantrum without a word. You corrected a legal document that 2 men had spent a week preparing. You memorized the new figures after hearing them only once. And you did it all while appearing to be nothing more than a piece of furniture. That is a rare and valuable skill." He paused, his gaze sweeping over her plain gray dress, her neatly pinned brown hair, her complete lack of ornamentation. "You are not a diamond of the first water, Miss Ingram. You are not what society expects in a duchess. But I am not interested in society's expectations. I am interested in results. You will have your own wing of the house, a generous allowance paid directly to you, and absolute authority over the domestic sphere. In return, you will bring order to my home. You will not be required to share my bed. You will, in effect, be the highest-ranking servant at Kestrel Chase, a steward with a coronet. Is that plain enough?" It was brutal. It was humiliating, and it was the most beautiful offer she had ever received. Escape, not just from her stepmother's casual cruelty, not just from the endless, thankless toil of an unpaid companion, but an escape into a world of purpose. A world where her competence, the very thing that made her an object of resentment here, would be her value. She thought of her life, the daily litany of small humiliations, the mending of her shallow stepsister Felicity's gowns while her own wore thin, the careful management of household accounts for which she received no credit, the knowledge that when her stepmother died, she would be turned out with nothing. She did not cry. She had learned long ago that tears changed nothing. "I have one condition," she said, her voice clear and strong. The Duke's eyebrow, a severe black line, rose a fraction of an inch. "Name it." "My mother left me an inheritance of £200. My stepmother is the trustee and has refused me access to it. I want it secured and placed in an account under my name alone before any marriage takes place." It was not the money itself. It was the principle. It was a piece of her own history, her own identity that she refused to leave behind. It was her test of him. A greedy man would balk. A dismissive man would wave it away as a trifle. Gideon Devereux simply nodded. "My solicitor will see to it this afternoon. It is a reasonable request." He saw it for what it was, not a demand for more, but a claim on what was rightfully hers, a desire for a foundation, however small, that was entirely her own. He found he respected it. "Then, Your Grace," Louisa said, taking a slow, steadying breath, "I accept your transaction." The contract was signed 2 days later. Lady Honora was incandescent with a rage she could not show, forced to congratulate the man her preferred candidate, the beautiful and well-connected Arabella Carmichael, had been angling for all season. She could not comprehend what the Duke saw in her plain, silent stepdaughter. She looked at Louisa and saw a mouse. The Duke looked at her and saw a finely calibrated instrument. When Louisa packed her single, worn trunk, her stepmother stood in the doorway. "Do not think this changes what you are," Honora hissed, her voice a venomous whisper. "You are a charity case with a title. He will tire of you before the winter is out." Louisa did not reply. She simply closed the lid of her trunk, the sound a quiet, final click. She was leaving. It was all that mattered. Her arrival at Kestrel Chase was as muted as the proposal. A carriage bearing the Devereux crest collected her. The journey was silent. The Duke sat opposite her, reading a treatise on agricultural drainage, and did not speak a single word. As they passed through the great stone gates of the estate, Louisa saw the house for the first time. It was magnificent. A symphony of grey stone and mullioned windows set against a backdrop of ancient oaks. But it was a beauty that held no warmth. It looked like a house holding its breath, waiting. The great doors swung open, and the staff were assembled in the cavernous entry hall. A line of grey and black uniforms, their faces etched with suspicion and a weary resentment. At their head was a formidable housekeeper with iron grey hair pulled into a severe bun and eyes that missed nothing. The Duke's introduction was brutally efficient. "This is your new Duchess," he announced to the silent hall. "Her orders are to be obeyed as if they were my own. Mrs. Ingram, you will show her grace to the Sutherland wing." He then turned, without another word to Louisa, and disappeared into his study, the heavy oak door closing with an air of finality. Louisa stood alone in the marble hall, the dozen pairs of hostile eyes fixed upon her. This was not a home. It was a kingdom in a cold civil war, and she had just been named its unwanted queen. Mrs. Ingram, the housekeeper, stepped forward, her expression unreadable. "If you will follow me, Your Grace," she said, the title tasting like ash in her mouth. The Sutherland wing was beautiful, with a sitting room, dressing room, and a vast bedroom overlooking a series of overgrown geometric gardens. But a fine layer of dust lay over every surface, and the air was stale and cold. The fires were unlit. It was clear no one had expected her to be anything more than a ghost. "The late Duchess designed these rooms herself," Mrs. Ingram said, her voice stiff with loyalty to the dead. "She had a very particular taste." Louisa ran a finger over the dusty mantelpiece. "I see." She looked at the housekeeper, meeting her gaze directly. "Mrs. Ingram, I will take my dinner on a tray in my sitting room this evening. Tomorrow morning, at 9, I would like to see the household account books for the last year, and I will require a complete inventory of the linen closets." The housekeeper's lips thinned. It was not what she had expected. She had expected hysterics, or demands for fashion magazines from London, or complaints about the dust. She had not expected a quiet, immediate demand for work, for ledgers. "Very good, Your Grace," she said, a flicker of something, perhaps grudging respect, in her cold eyes. Alone, Louisa walked to the window. Below, half hidden by a tangle of thorns and ivy, was a vast glass structure, a conservatory, its panes clouded with grime, its elegant iron frame weeping rust. It looked like a beautiful cage, where something precious had been left to die. A feeling of kinship resonated within her. She knew what it was to be trapped in a beautiful place and left to wither. She looked at the derelict glass house, and for the first time since arriving, she felt a flicker of something other than dread. She felt a purpose. The next days fell into a quiet rhythm. Louisa did not attempt to charm the staff. She did not issue grand proclamations. She worked. She rose early, and, with the account books spread before her, she began to untangle the snarled mess of Kestrel Chase's finances. She found redundancies, extravagances, and outright theft from local suppliers. She traced every penny with a meticulous, unforgiving focus. She walked the house, from the attics to the wine cellars, her notebook in hand. She learned its secrets, its weaknesses. The damp in the north wing, the faulty chimney in the library, the mice in the pantry. She spoke to the staff not as a duchess, but as a fellow professional. She asked the cook about the cost of flour from the mill in Marley. She asked the head groom about the price of oats. She listened. They were used to being ignored or scolded, not consulted. Slowly, cautiously, they began to answer. Her greatest challenge remained Mrs. Ingram. The housekeeper was a fortress of loyalty to the memory of the first Duchess, a beautiful, vivacious woman who had filled the house with laughter and parties before a sudden illness took her 5 years ago. To Mrs. Ingram, Louisa was a plain, silent usurper. She performed her duties with perfect, icy correctness, but offered no warmth, no welcome. Louisa's focus, however, was increasingly drawn to the locked conservatory. She asked Mrs. Ingram for the key. "It is kept in the Duke's study, Your Grace," the housekeeper said, her tone daring Louisa to pursue it. "No one has entered since before." That evening, at their silent dinner, a ritual they performed each night at opposite ends of a 30-foot dining table, Louisa spoke. "Your Grace, I require the key to the conservatory." Gideon did not look up from his plate. Why? It is a valuable asset to the estate, and it is falling into ruin. The glass is in danger of shattering, and the frame will soon be irreparable. She spoke of it as an accountant would, a line item in a ledger. He finally raised his eyes to hers. It was my late wife's project. She loved it. The words were flat, a statement of fact, but they hung in the air between them. A reason to preserve it, then, Louisa said quietly. He stared at her for a long moment, then gave a short, sharp nod. After dinner, he left a single ornate iron key on the hall table for her. There was no note. There was never a note. But the key was there. The next day, she unlocked the conservatory door. The screech of the rusted lock was painful. Inside, the air was thick and dead. The wreckage was breathtaking. Exotic plants, imported at vast expense, lay shriveled in their pots. The skeletons of vines clung to the walls. The delicate plumbing of the fountain was choked with grime and dead leaves. It was a mausoleum of forgotten beauty. Louisa felt no despair. She felt, instead, a profound sense of purpose. This, she understood. This was a problem of neglect. And neglect was something she knew how to fix. She rolled up the sleeves of her plain dress, found a pair of old gardening gloves in a rotting crate, and began to work. She started by sweeping the floor, clearing away the debris of 5 years of decay. It was hard, filthy work. She filled wheelbarrow after wheelbarrow with dead things. The staff watched her from the windows of the great house, murmuring amongst themselves. The new Duchess was in the dead lady's glass house, on her hands and knees, scrubbing the stone flags. It was unheard of. It was scandalous. It was fascinating. Mrs. Ingram watched, her face a stony mask. But that afternoon she appeared at the conservatory door with a cup of tea and a small plate of biscuits. She said nothing, simply placed the tray on a clean patch of floor and left. It was a truce, an offering, a beginning. From the window of his study, Gideon Devereux watched his wife. He had spent the week watching her. He had expected her to fail. He had expected tears, complaints, a retreat into the Sutherland wing with fashion plates and headaches. He had been wrong. He watched her now, her face smudged with dirt, her hair escaping its neat pins as she methodically cleaned years of grime from a pane of glass. She was not trying to restore his first wife's garden. He saw that now. She was clearing the ground. She was making a space for something new. His first marriage had been a masterpiece of public performance and private misery. Beatrice had been dazzling, a creature of light and laughter who charmed everyone she met. She had also been a liar. She had run up catastrophic debts, weaving intricate fictions to conceal her spending. She had been unfaithful, her affairs conducted with a carelessness that bordered on contempt. Her death, from a swift and sudden fever, had been a tragedy to the world. To Gideon, it had been a release from a prison of beautiful, smiling deceit. The experience had hollowed him out, leaving him with a bone-deep distrust of beauty, of charm, of all the pretty surfaces that concealed rot. He had chosen Louisa as one might choose a tool, for her utility, her lack of artifice. He had thought her plainness a virtue, her silence a shield. He had not expected it to have its own kind of power. He saw the way the staff was changing. The fear was receding from their eyes, replaced by a grudging respect. He heard the quiet hum of efficiency replacing the sullen silence of the house. He tasted it in the food, which was simpler now, but better, made with fresh herbs from a kitchen garden Louisa had started to reclaim. He looked at her, this quiet, industrious woman in the glass house, and felt a flicker of something he had long thought dead. It was not passion. It was not even affection. It was something harder, and perhaps more valuable. It was trust. He found a book on his shelf, a rare volume on the cultivation of orchids, and left it on the hall table where she would find it. It was as close to a conversation as he could manage. It was as close to a compliment as he had ever given. The whispers began in the town of Marley. They were carried on the scented air of the draper's shop and stirred into the gossip over tea at the baker's. They were planted with careful malice by Lady Honora Fenwick and her chosen protégée, the spurned Miss Arabella Carmichael. The story they wove was a simple and poisonous one. The poor, grieving Duke, lost in his sorrow, had been trapped by a cunning, grasping creature. A plain-faced schemer who had used some unknown leverage, some secret, to force him into a bizarre and hasty marriage. They painted Louisa as a social climber of the worst sort, a woman who had traded on his grief for a title. Louisa heard the whispers herself on a trip to the village to consult with the local blacksmith about repairing the conservatory's ironwork. The way the shopkeeper's wife fell silent when she entered, the pitying, curious glances from women who had once curtsied to her stepmother. She felt their judgment like a physical weight, but her expression remained serene. She conducted her business with quiet dignity, paid the man for his estimate, and returned to Kestrel Chase. She said nothing of it to the Duke. It was her battle, and she would fight it with the only weapon she had: silence. But her enemies were not content with whispers. They required a more public humiliation. A week later, a large crate arrived from the most expensive silk merchant in London. It was addressed to Her Grace, the Duchess of Kestrel Chase. The footman who brought it in carried it as if it were a bomb. The accompanying bill was for £300, a staggering sum. Gideon's steward, a nervous man named Fletcher, brought the bill to him in his study, his hands trembling slightly. "Your Grace, this has arrived. I knew you had not authorized such an expenditure, but it is in the Duchess's name." Gideon looked at the bill. £300 for silks. A cold, familiar dread coiled in his stomach. This was how it had begun with Beatrice. Small extravagances, then larger ones. Bills hidden, lies told. He had sworn he would never be that fool again. He had chosen a wife precisely because she was not the sort of woman to order London silks. Had he been wrong? Had her quietness been a different kind of mask? He did not summon her. He went to her. He found her in the conservatory, her hands covered in soil as she carefully repotted a single, surviving orchid. He held out the bill. His face was a cold, impenetrable mask. "I did not authorize this purchase," he said, his voice flat. "Did you?" It was the question on which their entire fragile arrangement rested. A simple question of fact, but it carried the weight of his entire, bitter history. He was not accusing her. He was testing her. He was watching for the flicker of deceit, the stammer of a lie. Louisa looked from the bill to his face. She saw the coldness in his eyes, but she also saw the flicker of old pain behind it. She wiped her hands on her apron, leaving a smear of honest dirt. She met his gaze without fear. "No, Your Grace," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I did not. The merchant claims the order was placed in your name." "Then the merchant is mistaken, or he is lying," she said simply. "My signature will not be on the order. I have not purchased so much as a new ribbon since I arrived here. You may examine my accounts. They are on the desk in my sitting room. You are welcome to them." She did not plead. She did not weep. She stated the facts. She offered evidence. She trusted him to be the man she thought he was, a man who valued truth above all else. He held her gaze for 1 second, 2, 3. He saw no fear in her eyes, no deception, only a quiet, unshakable integrity. He had built a fortress around his heart to protect himself from lies, and this woman, with her plain speech and her dirty hands, had just walked through the gate. He took the bill, and without another word, he walked to the small stove that heated the conservatory. He crumpled the paper in his fist and dropped it into the flames. They both watched it turn to black ash. "I believe you," he said. The words were quiet, but they were the strongest foundation they had yet built. He turned and left her there, among the green and growing things. We'll take a very short break. If you don't want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. The arrival of the Dowager Duchess, Theodosia Devereux, was preceded by a flurry of letters and a palpable wave of terror among the staff. Gideon's grandmother was the last of a formidable generation, a woman whose pronouncements could make or break a reputation in an afternoon. She had been wintering in Bath and was, her letter announced, returning to Kestrel Chase to inspect the new arrangement. She arrived in a cloud of black bombazine and disapproval. Theodosia was a tiny woman, with eyes as sharp and bright as a bird's. She surveyed Louisa from head to toe, her gaze missing nothing, from her simple dress to her unadorned hair. "So," the dowager said, her voice a dry rasp, "you are the one. The little wren my grandson has installed in the eagle's nest." "I am, your grace," Louisa replied, curtsying. She was not intimidated. She had been dealing with difficult matriarchs her entire life. For a week, Theodosia watched. She appeared silently in doorways, observing Louisa as she instructed the maids or went over menus with the cook. She would pick up the account books from Louisa's desk and scrutinize them for hours, her sharp eyes missing no detail. She walked the corridors, running a white-gloved finger over the furniture, testing for dust. She found no fault. The house was immaculate. The staff, while still wary, were efficient and respectful. The accounts were balanced to the penny. She saw the changes, the quiet restoration of order, and she was forced to be impressed. Finally, she summoned Louisa to her rooms. "The house is running well," she conceded, which for Theodosia was high praise. "Gideon has made a practical choice. But the county thinks he has lost his mind. They think you are a fortune hunter who has bewitched him." "What the county thinks is of no concern to me," Louisa said calmly. "My concern is Kestrel Chase." The dowager's lips twitched in what might have been a smile. "An excellent answer. Nevertheless, we will not allow fools and gossips to have the last word. We will host a dinner. A formal dinner for the 30 most important people in this county. You will take your place as the Duchess of Kestrel Chase, and we will silence them." It was a declaration of war, a gauntlet thrown down to Lady Fenwick and her allies. Louisa knew it was a test, and one she could not afford to fail. Preparations began at once. It was to be the first grand entertainment at Kestrel Chase in over 5 years. A nervous energy, a mixture of excitement and dread, filled the air. Louisa oversaw every detail, from the polishing of the silver to the seating arrangement, with her usual calm efficiency. She chose a simple menu, elegant but not ostentatious. She chose a gown of deep blue velvet, devoid of lace or frills, that she had sewn herself. On the night of the dinner, she stood beside Gideon at the top of the grand staircase to receive their guests. He was, as always, a silent, imposing figure in black and white. But as she took her place beside him, he glanced at her, a brief, assessing look. "You look appropriate," he said. It was, she knew, his version of a lavish compliment. Lady Honora Fenwick and Arabella Carmichael arrived together, their smiles brittle, their eyes glittering with malice. Arabella was a vision in pale pink silk and diamonds, designed to make Louisa look like a shadow. They greeted Louisa with a cloying sweetness that was more insulting than any snub. "My dear Louisa," Lady Fenwick said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "How wonderful to see you. You must be so overwhelmed by all this." "Not at all," Louisa replied, her own voice perfectly level. "I find it all quite manageable." The dinner was a tense affair. The guests watched Louisa, waiting for a misstep, a sign of her common origins. She gave them none. She conversed quietly but intelligently with the local magistrate about crop rotation and listened patiently to the vicar's wife's complaints about the church roof. She was a picture of serene competence. The attack, when it came, was perfectly staged. As the port was being served, Arabella gave a little cry of distress. "Oh, how clumsy of me!" she exclaimed, reaching for her reticule, which she had accidentally knocked from her lap. It fell open, spilling its contents, including a folded letter. A gentleman beside her, a known ally of the Carmichael family, gallantly retrieved it. "Oh, my dear, please don't," Arabella cried, but her protest was designed to draw attention. The gentleman, feigning confusion, began to read it aloud. "My dearest cousin, you will not believe my good fortune. The fish has taken the bait completely. The old fool is so lost in his grief, he barely notices what I do. I have already managed to send £50 home to settle Papa's debts, and he is none the wiser." A collective gasp went through the room. The letter was a vicious caricature, painting Louisa as a thief and a manipulative fraud. Every eye turned to her. Lady Fenwick wore a look of practiced sorrow. Arabella hid her face in her hands, a picture of false embarrassment at having revealed her friend's secret. The silence was absolute. Louisa felt the blood drain from her face, but she held her head high. She did not look at the letter. She did not look at her accusers. She looked at her husband. His face was granite. For a terrible, frozen moment, she thought she saw the old doubt, the old pain, flicker in his eyes. Then he rose to his feet. His movement was slow, deliberate. When he spoke, his voice was not loud, but it cut through the silence like a shard of ice. "An interesting piece of fiction, Miss Carmichael," he said. He looked not at her, but at the man who had read the letter. "Lord Ashworth, you would do well to choose your drawing-room performances more carefully in future." He then turned his gaze to the assembled guests. "My wife has been accused, in my own home, of theft and deception. It is an accusation I take very seriously." He reached into his own coat pocket and produced a small, folded document. "This is a letter from my wife to her solicitor in London, dated the week after our marriage. It instructs him to use her own personal inheritance, a sum of £200, which was hers by right, to settle the final debts of her late father. She did this without my knowledge, using her own funds so as not to be a burden on this estate. I have the solicitor's reply here, confirming the transaction." He placed the document on the table. The silence in the room was now one of stunned shock. But Gideon had not finished. "There is also the matter of the forgery itself." He gestured to a small, nervous-looking man standing near the doorway, a man no one had paid any attention to. "Mr. Tibbs, you are the proprietor of the stationers in Marley, are you not?" "I am, Your Grace," the man squeaked. "Mr. Tibbs, could you please examine the letter Miss Carmichael so carelessly dropped and compare it to this note from my wife?" Gideon produced a simple household note from Louisa. Mr. Tibbs scurried forward. He examined both sheets of paper under the candlelight, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Well, Your Grace," he announced, his voice growing stronger with the certainty of his expertise. "The Duchess's note is written on a high-quality cream vellum with a slight watermark, a custom order. The other letter," he said, pointing at the forgery with a disdainful finger, "is written on a common blue-laid paper, a cheaper stock. I sold a packet of that very paper to Lady Fenwick's housekeeper not a fortnight ago." The exposure was complete. It was brutal. It was total. The gasps this time were of outrage, directed not at Louisa, but at her accusers. Lady Fenwick's face was a mottled ruin of fury and humiliation. Arabella Carmichael had begun to sob, no longer feigning, but in genuine, panicked shame. It was the Dowager Duchess Theodosia who delivered the final, fatal blow. She rose from her seat, her small frame radiating an immense and terrible authority. She did not raise her voice. "Honora," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the room. "Arabella, for 5 years this house has been closed to society out of respect for its grief. Tonight, it opened its doors again, and you chose to bring your petty, vicious little poisons into it. You have mistaken quiet dignity for weakness. You have mistaken integrity for foolishness. You will find that this county has a long memory for such things." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "Your carriage is waiting. I suggest you do not keep it." It was not a request. It was a social execution. White-faced and trembling, Lady Fenwick and Arabella Carmichael fled the room, pursued by the silent, contemptuous stares of everyone present. They were finished. After the last of the shaken guests had departed, a profound quiet fell over Kestrel Chase. The staff moved silently, clearing away the evidence of the evening's battle. Louisa stood alone in the great hall, the adrenaline of the confrontation leaving her feeling hollow and cold. She had won. She had been vindicated. But she felt no triumph. She only felt tired. Gideon found her in the conservatory. She had retreated there without thinking, drawn to the one place that felt like her own. Moonlight streamed through the now spotless glass, silvering the leaves of the plants she had nurtured back to life. The air was warm and humid, fragrant with the scent of night-blooming jasmine. He did not speak at first, simply came to stand beside her, his presence a solid, reassuring weight in the quiet dark. "They are gone," he said finally. It was not an apology. It was a statement of fact. "I know," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. She was staring at a single white orchid, its petals perfect and luminous in the moonlight. He drew a breath. "Our contract," he began, and his voice was tight, strained with an unfamiliar emotion. "It stipulated that I would provide a duchess for Kestrel Chase. You have fulfilled that obligation with more honor and strength than I had any right to expect. The terms are satisfied." He paused, and the silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken things. "The contract also states that you may leave whenever you please." Louisa's heart, which had been beating so steadily throughout the entire ordeal, gave a painful lurch. He was offering her an exit. The transaction was complete. Her work was done. Louisa. He had never used her given name before. It sounded strange, and yet perfectly right in his low voice. She turned to look at him. His face, usually so controlled, was etched with a raw vulnerability she had never seen. "I am asking you to stay," he said, and the words seemed to be torn from him. Not as the Duchess of Kestrel Chase, bound by a contract. Not as the manager of my household, but as my wife. As my partner. He seemed to test the word, to find it inadequate. He reached out and, for the first time, took her hand. His fingers were warm and strong around hers. It was not a gesture of ownership, but of connection. A plea. "I have lived behind walls for 5 years, Louisa. Walls of silence and suspicion. You never tried to breach them. You simply planted a garden in their shadow. You brought life back to this place. To me." He looked down at their joined hands. "I do not offer poetry. I do not have a charming heart. But I have an honest one. And it is yours, if you will have it." He looked up, his pale gray eyes searching hers in the moonlight. "Plainly," he said, using the word that had been the foundation of their strange bargain, now transforming it into something new. A single tear, the one she had refused to shed in front of her enemies, traced a slow path down her cheek. It was not a tear of sorrow, but of a profound, overwhelming relief. The quiet ache she had carried within her for so long was finally dissolving in the warm, jasmine-scented air. "Plainly," she answered, her voice soft but as steady as his own. "Yes." 1 year later, the conservatory at Kestrel Chase was in full, riotous bloom. Sunlight poured through the glass, illuminating 1,000 shades of green, the vibrant jewel tones of orchids, and the delicate white of the jasmine that now climbed the walls. The house was no longer silent. The quiet hum of efficiency had been overlaid with something new, the sound of life, of quiet laughter, of purpose not just fulfilled, but enjoyed. Louisa sat on a stone bench, a sketchbook open on her lap, though she was not drawing. Her hand rested on the gentle curve of her stomach, a silent, happy promise. The doors to the conservatory stood open, and the warm, floral air drifted into the house. Gideon came to stand behind her. He did not speak, but rested a hand gently over hers on her belly. They stood like that for a long moment, a comfortable, shared silence that was more eloquent than any conversation. In his other hand, he held a small, worn, leather-bound book. "I found it," he said quietly. "A bookseller in York had it. Your stepmother sold his entire library after your father's death." He handed it to her. It was her father's field journal, the book of pressed flowers and botanical notes she had treasured as a child and thought lost forever. Her breath caught in her throat. She opened it with trembling fingers. The pages were filled with his neat, scholarly hand, and with the faded, delicate ghosts of flowers collected on their walks together. It was a piece of her past, her heart, that she had never expected to hold again. Gideon had opened the book to a fresh, empty page. He took a single, perfect blossom of night-blooming jasmine from a nearby vine, the very same vine that had perfumed the air on the night he had asked her to stay. He carefully placed it between the pages. "A new entry," he said. Louisa looked from the flower, to the book, to his face. The harsh angles seemed softer now. The winter in his eyes had thawed into a quiet, steady warmth that was reserved only for her. He was not a man transformed by a miracle, but a man who had been patiently, painstakingly brought back to life, just like the garden that surrounded them. She closed the book, pressing the new memory into the old. Kestrel Chase was no longer a cold refuge, and she was no longer an unwanted queen. It was not a transaction. It was home. Together. Plainly. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.